Welcome to the Omen Comics Podcast, where we talk about everything from writing comics to the philosophies held within them. My name is Michael Nunneley, the creator of the Omenverse, and with me, as always, is my friend Steve Sellers, the creator of the Blitzverse.
Today we're talking about death in comics. Deaths that affected us greatly, and what we've learned about writing deaths in comics from the deaths that we read in comics.
Well, yeah, when you're talking about death in comics, you really want to think about not only just how the death is executed or the impact of it, but you also want to think of the long-term results of this. And one example I like to think about and that particularly had impact on me, was the death of Captain Marvel. And it's a classic story. Absolutely, you should read it if you haven't already. The way that it goes, if you haven't read it, talking 20-plus-year-old spoilers here.
I think it's
yeah. Well, yeah, and towards the end of Starlin's run on Captain Marvel originally, he fought this villain called Nitro. You might have heard of him from Civil War. He was the guy who killed the New Warriors. And basically, during the fight that Marvel had with him, Marvel was exposed to a carcinogenic gas, which he didn't know was carcinogenic when he got hit with it. But he closed the canister to contain it with his bare hands, and he got exposed to it. He did not know at first that this was going to kill him. It took a long time later, at the start of the story, where he kind of discovers this with his cosmic awareness. And then the rest of the story really deals with Marvel dealing with this thing that he can't fight. He can't go and get help from the heroes doing this because his own powers are blocking every treatment attempt that they have, because he's wearing these nega bands that basically release photonic energy, and the same ones that his son Genisvel has or had. And so he's being killed by his own powers in part, or at least they're resisting any treatment. And so, a lot of it is Marvel sort of dealing with the stages of acceptance, or from moving from, anger to acceptance, because, he's missing out on his whole life, and he can't even, stand up to it like he would a supervillain. So in the end, the story is about a man basically facing death with dignity, facing death that he can't avoid like a hero. And in the end, he's rewarded for this. He's given a peaceful death at the end of it. But that journey makes it really interesting. Even though there's not a lot of fighting in it, it's very character driven, and it kind of shows that even heroes can deal with the same kind of mortality that anyone else can. And that's why this thing is kind of stuck with me, even after all these years. And I think it also has helped that this is one of the few Marvel deaths that has not been reversed or retconned or changed. It's a story that has stayed and has had impact on other characters, especially his children, Janice and Phyla, we've seen over the years, and Carol Danvers, obviously. So in the end, it has impact in that way.
You know what I had not considered before was that most writers are aware that the greatest opponent for someone to face is eventually themselves.
Yes.
And so for Captain Marvel, he's defeated so many foes. He was such a great hero, and then he ultimately beat himself in the sense that he was able to die with pride and dignity.
Yeah, and because he's dealing sort of with his own anger. He's used to fighting all of his problems like a warrior, and he has to kind of learn that not every problem can be fought that way, and how to you deal with the situation, how to deal with a no-win scenario, as they say in Star Trek 2.
Yes. And speaking of Star Trek 2, it seems like Captain Marvel pulled a Spock in closing that thing and ended up getting sick because of it.
Yeah, it's much the same way. Yeah, yeah, because Spock got hit with that lethal dose of radiation. It
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
it wasn't a heroic death in the same way Spock's was, but it was a different kind of heroism.
Right, right.
It was bravery in the face of death as opposed to heroic sacrifice.
So why did that have a big impact on you?
Well, I've had family members that have died, not necessarily of cancer, but of things that are not that far removed. And so, the thing with Marvell's death is that even if the exact type of death or cause of death is different, the way people struggle, with having a sick family member, it's the same way. It's something that has a universal, I think, resonance because of that.
Really, really hit you where you live then.
Yeah.
I don't know. I had a pretty, well, I almost think that this is too big of a word for this, but I want to say a traumatic experience with a death in comics myself.
Tell me more.
Now, when you're talking the Blue Beetle, and I'm talking about Ted Kord, the previous Blue Beetle,
Mm-hmm.
he he was kind of ridiculed as a joke for a long time, and it kind of, especially with the run leading up into Infinite Crisis there. You get him really trying to make almost not just prove himself to himself, but to everyone else that I'm actually a legitimate person on this team, and I have a place here, and that type of a thing.
Yeah, and I think that follows pretty well from the Super Buddy miniseries that Keith Giffen and John Mark DeMatteis did, where he really was dealing with a heart condition, and because of that, that really caused him to mature. And I think that is kind of like a natural next step. I want to be taken seriously. I want to, not be the guy that's, making dumb jokes with Booster Gold all the time. I love both of them, by the way.
Right, right. Me too. Me too. I love that. But I really got attached to Ted Kord during that series. Particularly because of how he was with Booster Gold.
Mm-hmm.
But not just that. It was when he was the one that came across the information that led to the Infinite Crisis, that
Mm-hmm.
Checkmate was actually alive and well, and that Maxwell Lord was leading it. The OMAC project, Brother Eye, he came across all of that,
Mm-hmm.
and you got this. I had this feeling, reading along with the story, that he's finally done it. He's finally this is going to solidify him in comics forever. He has finally run onto this. He's discovered what's going on before everybody else. Even Batman isn't onto this, and
Mm-hmm.
he tries to fight Maxwell Lord and gets stopped by other members of the Justice League, Batman and Hunters particularly. He goes to a couple of them trying to tell them what's going on, and everybody dismisses him like he's been afraid of this whole time, that he's not being taken seriously.
Yeah.
And so he actually goes after Maxwell Lord in that castle himself, and Maxwell Lord gives him the ultimatum: you can join me or you can die. And right up to that moment, and of course, again, we're talking about pretty old spoilers here.
Oh yeah.
Right up to that moment, where Ted Kord tells Maxwell Lord, he says, "Rotten hell, Max," and Maxwell Lord pulls the trigger. You see his brain splatter out the other side of his head, and he hits the floor. That whole, right up to that second where he actually shot him in the head, I could have sworn something was going to happen. Something was going to stop Ted from being killed. And
Yeah.
when he wasn't, I don't know how to describe it. Like, it broke a part of me.
Well, because you're kind of used to heroes finding a way out of the last second or finding, or somebody being saved at the last second. But
Right.
no, and I think it was Jeff Johns who wrote that issue, if I remember
Yes.
right. Yeah, I mean, Jeff Johns really, knew how to, hit you in the gut at times, and that's really one of those moments where I think he really did that.
For sure. That drastically affected me, and especially when I realized that they weren't going to bring Ted Cord back, and that they were actually giving the Scarab to some other kid. that really bothered me.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how to take it myself at first, because I was like, I really like this character. Why are you doing this, DC? But at the same time, I did end up liking Jaime Reyes quite a bit. And when they rebooted this, for Rebirth and all that, when they brought Ted and Jaime together for a little while, it was a lot of fun, and I'm glad that they did that. But yeah, at the time, it really was one of those big shocking moments.
I wouldn't even give Jaime Reyes a chance for the first 6 or 7 issues of the new Blue Beetle series and the new 52. I wouldn't even read it. I'm like, I don't care what this little kid is doing about anything.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's always kind of the thing with legacy characters, but that could be another episode.
Right, that's for sure. So when we're talking about deaths in comics, what kinds of things, like what lessons have you learned about deaths in comics that would help you in the future if you were going to write a scene or a story about a character dying?
Well, I would say, first of all, you really want to make sure that the deaths have impact, and that kind of means that in general, you probably want to avoid doing it too often, because the more that you do it, the less impact it has. The reason why, something like a Ted Cord work was, it came out of nowhere. You weren't expecting them to do this. But looking at kind of specific examples, I'll kind of show you, 2 examples that are similar, but you can kind of decide for yourself like which one worked better and which one didn't. I think they're kind of strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, and they mainly kind of center around the X-Men, because as all things do. and with this one, I would kind of look at the death of Thunderbird, which because that's like one of the few X-Men deaths that have stuck. And the fact that they didn't bring him back, but instead created a new character to fill the role, I thought that was a little stronger. But in the case of Thunderbird, what you had was a situation where Thunderbird was a ticking time bomb. He was a guy driven by anger, because of how his people were treated, and basically, being a minority in every sense of the word, not just because he was a native, but also because he was a mutant, and and he really had a chip on his shoulder and wanted to prove himself. And because of this, he jumped on Count Nefaria's plane as Nefaria was escaping, and he just like, I don't care. I am going to punch this plane into oblivion. I don't care if I'm on it. I don't care if I'm hundreds of feet in the air and I might not be able to survive the trip down. I am going to get this guy. And because of this, he ended up killing himself in the explosion. After he hit it one too many times.
Which is what he wanted all along, right? He had a death wish anyway.
Yeah, he had a bit of a death wish, and this was one of those things that haunted Cyclops for a long time. And one of the reasons why I think this death worked in a sense was because it really did hit Scott for a long time. He was constantly blaming himself because he lost a man in the field, and he should. And Scott Summers is a perfectionist. He's one of these people that always has to have everything exactly perfect, or he's done a terrible job. So this was one of those things that really haunted him for a long time. He got over it eventually, but I like that aspect of it. But
Scott just didn't really deal with loss well in general.
He doesn't deal with losing well in general. So I like that it had that impact. The only downside is I really feel like at the time we didn't get to know Thunderbird perhaps as well as we could have. There were later stories that kind of filled in some of the gaps, particularly like the classic X-Men, backups and things like this. But he was really not a character we got to know, beyond sort of those hints that, this guy had a death wish and, had a beef with Wolverine, because who doesn't? But I kind of feel like that's like one of those areas where it could have been a little bit better. In contrast, I also really love the X-Men animated series. And the first episode had kind of a stand-in for Thunderbird. I think that's probably not fair to them to say that. It's really more that he sort of occupied that role because they didn't want to use that particular character. And so they had this new character, Morph, who was based on Changeling, who was another character who died earlier. And the thing I kind of liked about that version was that I feel like they took a little more time in making you like him. Now, it could be that they may have overdone it in certain respects, but I kind of felt like, this was a guy who was having a good time. He was with the X-Men because, he was enjoying the adventures and having, fun while doing it. And he was, kind of a lighter influence on them. And then when he died, it was, you kind of lost that innocence, that light, and that kind of stuck with them after a while. And it also kind of heightened the tensions between Scott and Wolverine, because Wolverine blamed Scott instead of Scott just blaming himself, which I thought was an interesting alternate take on it.
So it sounds like you're what you learned from those was that with Thunderbird and with Morph, one that you learned that you need to have some kind of setup to get you attached to the character.
Yes, very much so.
But what's more than that, it sounds like you're saying that the death of the character is felt more through the reaction of those left behind than it is by the actual death itself.
Yeah, because ultimately this character is not sticking around, but the character's presence can be felt through their impact on the characters that they know and that cared about them, particularly if it's like somebody they had a really strong relationship with. So like in the example of Marvel, obviously his children are defined by this impossible legacy because their father was the universe's greatest hero. How do you live up to that?
Right.
So that's kind of sort of one example. With Thunderbird, it was more that, okay, it's a sense of failure and a sense that, I should have seen the signs and I should have been better at this. Whereas with Morph, it's more, they're blaming each other. It's kind of, there's a certain amount of resentment that it builds, but also, kind of the sense that, the innocence is gone, anybody can die at any time. And that was one of the things that I think both deaths to a certain extent, accomplished. So when they killed Jean, that was a big thing at that time because, they had already shown, yeah, we'll kill anybody that we have to.
So kind of like I like to call it the Scream effect, from how I don't know if you saw the movie Scream, but they killed Drew Barrymore right in the first part of the movie.
Yes.
That kind of effect when you're like, okay, so literally anybody can die at any time in this movie.
Pretty much, yeah. Because if you're willing to kill an A-list star,
right.
The same thing. And also, I think it's something that was kind of taken from Psycho. Where Janet Leigh was the you thought that she was the heroine like for the first 20 so minutes, and then she's the one who ends up in the shower getting stabbed to death by Norman Bates, and then it's her sister and the boyfriend that end up investigating that.
That's actually a good example of what you're talking about there in the movie sense, in that they spent that first like 20-25 minutes of the movie. You're investing in this character and her having the money, getting it from work, and should I steal it? Should I not? What's going on, right? You're getting all into this, and then that made her death in that movie so much more impactful. But it's because you got to know her first.
Yeah, and you see why she's there, but with the Janet Leigh character, it's that you can tell that she's struggling with guilt over the money that she embezzled. You can tell that she doesn't, exactly feel good about it, especially, when she comes face to face with that cop on the road, where
Yes.
some of her guilt starts showing, and the cop can tell that something's not right about this lady, and those kind of moments sort of make you feel okay. There is, this is a human person, and we care about her, and we want her to do the right thing in the end. But she never gets that chance because she stops for a night at Bates Motel, and the rest is history.
Right.
And she's history.
Yes. I'm not. Yeah. That's some craziness. So that
Mm-hmm.
you kind of learned a variety of things from just those couple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I always think that examples always teach a lesson for good or for bad, and when you see like how the masters do it, the people that have spent a long time learning to do it, those are the kind of lessons you learn for free, and you kind of want to apply them as much as possible.
Right. I definitely I picked up some stuff on the classic Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Oh, I'm interested.
There was because and I got this mostly from what I heard George Perez talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But he had mentioned how you have Supergirl, she dies in issue 7, and you got her right on the cover of the issue, dead in Superman's arms.
Yeah,
That
and
death had a huge impact.
yeah, and I think a lot of it is that they hit you with an image that reinforces the loss and makes it stick with you. The fact that we're dealing not just with words, but with pictures, and when you have a really good picture that shows how painful the moment is, or the just how gruesome it is, or anything like that, that has an impact that words can't always get across well. And I think that was the case with Crisis.
For sure, for sure. But one thing I learned there was that you take the Flash, an equally popular character at the time, Barry Allen, and they killed him in issue number 8, and even did it. If it wasn't for Barry Allen, they wouldn't have been able to defeat the Anti-Monitor. That is how important his death was. But yet it was less impactful because it came along in the next issue.
Yeah, I think they kind of shot their load a little bit with Cars Or-El, and it was a great death. I mean, and certainly I don't want to diminish Barry's sacrifice, because not only was it a really good send off, it was a death that had impact on his successors, especially Wally West, and all those years he was the Flash.
Yeah, he had to spend his life trying to live up to the legend that Barry Allen created himself. He died saving the Earth.
Yeah, and how do you live up to that? And that
right?
was Wally's journey, as he kept getting faster and kept getting better, and learning about the Speed Force and all the other things that he did.
Right, it definitely had an effect on that. One of the things I think the next thing I learned was actually a mixture between the death of Superman and the death of Barry Allen.
All right.
You had mentioned one of the things that was prudent in a death being impactful was that it sticks. And that was one of the things that was so impactful, but it was deflated some in the death of Barry Allen.
Mm-hmm.
In that he stayed dead until Rebirth.
Right.
that makes a huge difference in the reader's perspective.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. There may have been some people that thought that Superman was always going to come back, but I like the way that they held it off for a while by saying, "Oh, well, Superman's dead. Well, how are we going to keep going? Well, we're going to have these 4 guys that might or may not be Superman, and follow them for a while, and then towards the end we have the real Superman come back." I think as a 3-part story in and of itself, I mean, it definitely is impactful, but in terms of being a death as it as in and of itself. I mean, the problem with resurrections is always that when you do it, and especially when you do it too much, death really kind of loses its impact, which is why it really shouldn't be too common.
Very true. I think, yeah. All right. I think like we were talking about with how the death of Thunderbird and Morph was felt more by those that were left behind.
Yes.
And I think in that same way, that whole what was it in the comics? About a year without Superman?
It was something like that. They followed the four replacement characters for quite a bit.
Right, but Superman didn't return for a year. And
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Through that, thinking that even like once I finally, I determined, okay, Cyborg Superman, not Superman. Okay,
Yeah.
Eradicator, not Superman.
Superboy, not Superman.
I went through the list and I was like, okay, none of these people are Superman.
Yeah.
So for at least a half a second there, I was like, wait a minute, are they actually bringing him back or not? But
yeah,
that impact, I think, was felt not just because of the big buildup of how they did the death with like the going down in panel numbers.
Oh yeah, the
down.
big climactic fight with Doomsday, which was very well done. I mean, Dan Jurgens absolutely nailed that.
Yes, I think that really made a difference because of the middle story there, the world without Superman.
Yes, and I think that part of the reason is the impact, not just on the characters that they knew, but also on the fact that Superman is this force of inspiration, and when you don't have that, who picks up the mantle? Well, you have a kid, a guy in a suit of armor, a robot, and and a cyborg, and you see how the different ways in which they were influenced by Superman for good or for bad, and I think that made a big difference too.
That's kind of a common theme. I didn't occur to me until just now that when you get a monumental character like that who dies,
Mm-hmm.
there are those that are willing to take up the fight in their name. And
yes,
the particular thing I'm thinking of right now is that We Are Robin series. Damian Wayne died.
Right. Yeah, and really the reason why Damian had impact was because Grant Morrison spent so many years in Batman, Batman and Robin, and so on, and Batman Incorporated for a little bit, building up this character and kind of showing how he went from being the grandson of Ra's al Ghul into being the son of Batman. And that took a long time, learning from his father, learning from Dick Grayson, and ultimately choosing his own path. And then so when he dies at that point, if you followed that story, that had its impact. But if you're just reading this one book out of this one series, well, maybe not so much.
Definitely makes a difference. I think that's one thing I can take away from here is it definitely makes a difference. Not just that someone is dying, but you have to not just know the character, but care about the character before they die.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what did they live for? What did they die for? What are they leaving behind?
Exactly, and that leads to the second part there. You need to express that, like you want the hit to happen with the death, right? But that lingering pain after the hit that sits in everyone that's left behind afterwards is a crucial part of writing that death story. It has to be felt through those that remain.
Yes. And it has to feel like it's a natural resolution to their character arc, whatever that is. So for Damian, that is, basically embracing the way of the bat as opposed to the way of the assassin.
Right, and rather poetically doing it in defiance of his mother.
Right.
So literally defying his roots to embrace being the son of Batman.
Yeah, and there was a particular scene in Batman and Robin that I really, really love where he confronts his mother and he says, And she said, well, you're going to be an enemy from now on. And his response is, I hope I'm a worthy one. I'm paraphrasing, but that was more or less the sentiment.
Right.
That if I'm going to be your enemy from now on, I will be the best enemy you've ever had, because that is my way of showing my love for you as a mother. That was just really, really well done.
Only in the Al Ghul family can something
Yeah.
that messed up come across as emotional.
Yeah. But I mean, but it showed, the humanity in the character as well as, the growth of Damien over time.
All right. I think I don't know about you, but I learned quite a bit about writing in as far as death in comics and how they can affect readers for sure today.
Well, I think that there's plenty of information that hopefully will be useful.
All right. So for the listeners, what was a death that really impacted you, and why was that so impactful on you? What have you learned about death in comics? What are your opinions on it? Share them with us.
Yeah, and because you may very well have different deaths that mean something to you, and I would really be curious to see what those are.
That would be great. All right, you guys have a good one. Live long and prosper.
Thank you for listening to the Omen Comics podcast. This has been Steve Sellers and Michael Nunneley here with Omen Comics. And we encourage you to look into all our Omenverse titles, wherever they might be sold, including Comixology, Amazon, Draw Me in Comics, and elsewhere. If you like our content, please like, subscribe, hit the magic bell for notifications. And until next time, we'll see you in the Omenverse.